The evening fog rolled softly through the back lanes of Kennington, a quiet pocket of London south of the Thames. Rows of narrow brick houses stood shoulder to shoulder beneath a gray sky that was slowly turning to amber. A lamplighter moved from post to post with a long brass pole, and one by one the gas flames fluttered to life, each one painting a warm halo on the damp cobblestones. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and wet wool. A hansom cab rolled past with a gentle rumble, its wheels splashing through shallow puddles. In the upper window of a modest lodging house, a candle flickered behind thin curtains. It was the kind of evening that asked nothing of anyone, just slow breath and a quiet heart. This was the world that welcomed a small boy on the 16th of April in 1889. Charles Spencer Chaplin was born into a family that already lived inside the fragile magic of the music hall. His father, also named Charles, was a singer with a sweet baritone voice who earned decent applause in the smoke-filled theaters of the Empire Circuit. His mother, Hannah, performed under the name Lily Harley, a soubrette with bright eyes and a bloom of hope in her cheeks. For a short while, the little flat felt like a place of velvet and melody, where costumes sparkled and a child's bedtime songs came from real stage stars. But the glitter of the footlights was never far from the cold draft of the street. Gin and fading engagements began to fray the edges of that small world, and the music gradually grew quieter in the house. When Charlie was barely 3, his father departed, and Hannah was left to weave a living from shifts at the sewing machine and the increasingly rare offers to sing. The two of them moved from one rented room to another, each one a little smaller, each staircase a little steeper. The boy would sit on the floor and watch his mother mend costumes by the light of a paraffin lamp, his tiny shadow stretching long across the bare walls. Sometimes she would tell him stories of the stage, of grand theaters where chandeliers sparkled and audiences roared, and for a moment the room felt full again. But the stories, like the coins in the jar on the mantelpiece, grew fewer. The city outside was noisy with delivery carts and street cries, but inside, the silence was a presence that the boy learned to tiptoe around. That silence deepened into hunger. By the time Charlie was 5, Hannah's health had begun to unravel, and the workhouse loomed like a gray fortress at the edge of the imagination. The Lambeth workhouse stood solid and unsmiling, its brick facade rising against an overcast sky. On the day they first passed through its iron gates, a raw wind tugged at the boy's cap, and the long windows of the dormitory stared down like empty eyes. Inside, the floors smelled of carbolic soap and boiled cabbage. The children's ward was a hall of narrow beds and thin blankets, where small bodies slept in rows beneath high ceilings. Young Charlie clung to the quietest corners, watching the pale daylight move across the floorboards, and in that institutional stillness, he began to study the world of small gestures and silent expressions. In that same year, a strange and luminous moment broke through the gloom. Hannah was performing at a theater in Aldershot, her voice now cracking and her breath unsteady. The crowd grew restless, and the manager, desperate for anything to fill the stage, lifted little Charlie onto the boards. The boy stood alone in the sudden brightness, a tiny figure before a sea of half-lit faces. He began to sing a popular song, his small voice surprisingly steady, and when coins started to clatter onto the stage, he stopped singing and began to pick them up, talking to the audience with complete sincerity. Laughter rolled back toward him, warmer than any blanket. The gas footlights flickered, and for a few minutes, the sharp edges of his life softened into something like belonging. When Hannah was taken to the infirmary, the children were separated. Charlie and his older half-brother Sidney moved through a series of bleak institutions, including the Hanwell School for Orphans, a place of strict routines and echoing corridors. The boys walked in silent lines, their boots scuffing worn wooden floors. Outside, a single tree stood in the courtyard, its leaves catching the sepia light of a London afternoon. The world was teaching Charlie the art of careful observation. He learned to read the tilt of a shoulder, the droop of an eyelid, the way a person's entire story could be told in the way they stirred a cup of tea. These were the lessons not written on any blackboard, and they planted seeds in the quiet soil of his imagination. At the age of 9, a small door opened. Charlie joined a clog dancing troupe called the Eight Lancashire Lads, a band of working-class boys who toured the music halls with bright smiles and perfectly timed steps. The rehearsal room was dusty and smelled of rosin and sweat, but sunlight poured through the high windows and made the wooden floor glow like honey. The boy learned to spin and bow, to feel the rhythm rise through the soles of his thin leather shoes. Backstage, he pressed his ear to the curtain and listened to the audience breathing. When the boys tumbled onto the stage, the gaslight caught their faces, and for a few precious moments, the workhouse and the hunger and the cold staircases were all held at bay by the simple, silent power of a well-timed smile. By the time Charlie entered his teenage years, the music hall had become his true home, a place of worn velvet and echoing laughter where the world's care seemed to dissolve in the glow of the stage apron. The Canterbury Theatre of Varieties stood on Westminster Bridge Road with a painted facade of curling gold letters. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cigar smoke and orange peel. Patrons sat at little marble-topped tables, nursing glasses of stout while the orchestra pit churned out jaunty tunes. Above them, the balcony curved like a horseshoe of plush seats, and everywhere were faces eagerly tilted toward the flood of light. Young Chaplin, now a confident performer, would stand in the wings and breathe in that atmosphere, memorizing every detail, from the way the spotlight operator adjusted the arc lamp to the exact moment a punchline lifted the crowd. He worked his way through small dramatic parts and comedy sketches, learning to command attention without words. The comedy of the halls was broad and physical, full of pratfalls and painted-on mustaches, but Charlie was already refining something quieter. He noticed that the audience responded just as strongly to a sad pause as they did to a kick in the pants. In a dusty theater in the provinces, he experimented with a little hesitation, letting his trouser leg catch on a chair just long enough to draw a laugh that was softer and somehow sweeter. The stagehands would nod approvingly. Behind him, flats painted with country gardens and Victorian drawing rooms were dragged into place by men in shirt sleeves, and the whole machinery of illusion creaked along like a grandfather clock. When he was 19, the celebrated impresario Fred Carnot brought him into his traveling comedy company, the so-called Speechless Comedians. The Carnot troupe was famous for polished pantomime sketches that needed no dialogue to travel across the Atlantic. The rehearsal hall in Manchester was a cavernous room with tall mirrors and a floor scarred by countless soft shoe shuffles. Here Charlie met another young comedian named Arthur Jefferson, who would later become Stan Laurel. They shared a cheap lodging house together, and on rainy afternoons the two of them would sit by the window, their suitcases propped open, silently miming a scene of two strangers sharing a bench. The rain trickled down the glass, and the world outside was a blur of cobblestone and chimney smoke. Even then, Chaplin was learning that the most powerful comedy was built on the smallest observations. In 1910, Carnot sent a group to America for the first time, and Charlie had his own brown cardboard suitcase packed and ready. He boarded a steamship at Liverpool, the gangway clattering under his feet, and stood at the rail as the English coast dissolved into a ribbon of mist. The journey was not remarkable, just a few days of gray Atlantic waves and the smell of salt and engine oil, but to Chaplin it felt like a page-turning that would never turn back. Below decks, he listened to the steady heartbeat of the engines and rehearsed his sketches in a tiny cabin where the lamplight swayed with the motion of the sea. Everything he had ever known was shrinking on the horizon, and ahead lay a city that existed only in the stories told by returning actors. They docked in New York Harbor on a morning of thin, watery sunshine. The skyline of Manhattan rose from the mist like a jagged frieze of stone and steel, but Charlie's eyes were drawn to the simpler things: the ferries crossing the Hudson, the laundry fluttering on a tenement roof, a peddler pushing a cart of apples. The pavements were crowded, the elevated railway clattered overhead, and the air smelled of roasted chestnuts and newsprint. He walked through the streets of the Lower East Side, past Yiddish theaters and Italian bakeries, feeling at once utterly foreign and strangely at home. That evening, he stood on his rented room's tiny balcony, watching the city's lights crackle into being one by one, and he knew that this place would one day cradle his dreams. The Carno tour took him across the continent on trains that rattled through endless farmland and stopped in dusty towns where the Opera House was the only building with a chandelier. At night, after the show, Charlie would step onto the wooden sidewalk and look up at the vast American sky, stars sharp as pinpricks in the velvet darkness. He grew used to the rhythm of booking agents, railway timetables, and the smell of grease paint in a new dressing room each week. One afternoon, in a Philadelphia theater, a telegram arrived from a film company called Keystone, asking him to come to California to work in moving pictures. Charlie held the slip of yellow paper in the light of the stage doorman's lantern, and the word Keystone glowed like a secret. He could not have known then that this single sheet of paper would change the shape of the silent world forever. Before he left for the West, he walked one last time along a stretch of Broadway, not yet the Great White Way, but a string of smaller theaters and arcades. The street was wet after a brief shower, and the reflections of the electric signs shimmered in long, trembling streaks on the asphalt. A few newsboys were calling the final editions, and a lone streetcar clanged its bell softly as it rounded a corner. Charlie stood for a moment, his hands in the pockets of his shabby coat, and felt the quiet thrill of the unknown settle over him like a cool, clean sheet. When the train finally pulled into Los Angeles in December of 1913, Charlie stepped onto the platform into a world of lemony sunshine and the unexpected perfume of citrus groves. The air was dry and clean, nothing like the sooty breath of London, and the sky stretched overhead in a shade of blue so pure it seemed almost artificial. The street outside the station was unpaved, and a mule-drawn trolley clattered past as he walked toward his new lodgings. A few miles west, the town of Hollywood was little more than a cluster of bungalows, ranch houses, and bean fields, but already the motion picture business was putting down roots. The Keystone Studio stood on a quiet lot in Edendale, a neighborhood of dusty lanes and eucalyptus trees, where the smell of fresh lumber and photochemicals drifted on the breeze. The studio itself was a simple cluster of open-air stages roofed with white canvas, designed to catch and soften the Southern California sunlight. Charlie arrived early in the morning, his shoes crunching on the gravel, and found a world of controlled chaos that somehow felt as gentle as a quiet workshop. Carpenters moved slowly among half-built sets that depicted parlors, kitchens, and improbable balconies. A tramp actor in grease paint sat on an apple box, eating a sandwich while a director traced marks in the sawdust. The camera, a heavy wooden box on an iron tripod, was being cranked by a man in rolled-up sleeves who hummed a soft tune as he worked. Nobody shouted. The whole enterprise had the leisurely rhythm of a small, sunlit village, and Chaplin, who had grown used to the fierce tempo of the music hall, felt an unexpected wave of calm. He did not take to the camera immediately. His first film, a one-reel comedy called Making a Living, was shot in a blur of slapstick and misunderstanding. Max Sennett, the head of Keystone, wanted broad, fast gags, but Charlie felt that speed alone was not his instrument. After a trying morning, he wandered away from the main stage into a corner of the lot where props were stored. The prop shed was a quiet cave of forgotten treasures, smelling of old glue and varnish. Piles of canes, mismatched gloves, dented derby hats, and dusty waistcoats waited on sagging shelves. Sunlight slanted through the gaps in the wooden walls, making the dust motes dance. In that silent room, Charlie began to assemble something that was not yet a character, just a loose collection of borrowed gestures. One afternoon in January of 1914, he walked into the wardrobe department and began to dress himself for a short film called Kid Auto Races at Venice. He chose a pair of baggy trousers from one actor's pile, a tight cutaway coat from another, a tiny derby hat, and a pair of shoes so large that the toes flapped when he walked. He cut a small wedge of crepe hair and glued it beneath his nose as a mustache, so slight that expressions would still be visible. Finally, he picked up a slender bamboo cane, swinging it lightly between his fingers. When he emerged onto the sun-drenched set, the other actors turned to look, not with laughter but with a kind of quiet recognition. He was no longer Charlie Chaplin, a young English stage comedian. He was somebody else entirely, someone who did not yet have a name but already had a soul. The film itself was a simple thing, a camera crew shooting an amateur car race, and a little tramp who cannot stop wandering into the frame. But from the very first twirl of his cane, audiences in the darkened Nickelodeons leaned forward. The Nickelodeon theater was a modest room, usually a converted storefront with a few rows of wooden seats, a white sheet for a screen, and a piano player in the corner improvising to the flickering images. The projector clicked and hummed, and the beam of light cut through the smoky air like a shaft of silver. In that intimate space, the tramp lived and breathed. People saw in his shuffling walk and apologetic smile a reflection of their own small struggles. By the end of that single reel, the tramp had not only walked into the frame, but into the heart of the entire motion picture world. As the weeks passed, Chaplin refined the character on the quiet back streets of Edendale. He would rise at dawn and walk along the empty road, practicing the tramp's peculiar walk, a pigeon-toed waddle that turned at the last moment into an elegant spin. A few local children sometimes followed him, copying his steps and giggling, and he would pause and tip his hat to them with great solemnity. The landscape around him was a patchwork of empty lots and orange orchards, with purple mountains rising in the distance. The morning light, soft and golden, stretched long shadows across the unpainted fences. Here, far from the music hall's roar, he discovered that silence itself could be a kind of music. A hesitant step, a shy glance, a single flower handed to a stranger, these became the vocabulary of a new poetic language. Hollywood was still a drowsy garden back then. The big studios were only just beginning to appear, and in the evenings Charlie would walk home beneath pepper trees that smelled faintly of spice. The roads were unpaved, and automobiles were still a novelty, sharing the lanes with horse-drawn wagons. Sometimes he would stop at a little roadside stand selling oranges and sit on a wooden crate, peeling the fruit while the sunset turned the sky into ribbons of peach and lavender. He was still a young man, not yet 25, but he felt older than his years, as if he had been walking toward this quiet corner of the world through decades of fog. And when he closed his eyes at night, he could see the tramp still moving, still twirling his cane, still facing the world with a gentle, unbroken wonder. In 1915, Chaplin left Keystone for the S&A Company, and the little tramp packed his suitcase once again. The morning he walked through the studio gates for the last time, a light breeze stirred the eucalyptus leaves, and the sound they made was like the soft rustle of an audience settling into its seats. The tramp was ready for a larger stage.